Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar, or the second part of this webinar. Could somebody just pop into the chat, please, just to say that you can hear me and see my screen, just so I know that. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, there's still a few people just arriving, so we'll give them just a moment as well. Okay, well, thank you very much, as I say, for attending this second part of the webinar, which is looking at test automation with UFT and Octane as part of continuous integration, continuous delivery. This is the second webinar. So the first webinar there's a YouTube link down on the bottom, but if it hasn't been already, it will be emailed out to everyone, the recording of the webinar from last week. And we'll just talk about what that covered in case you didn't attend that briefly in a moment. My name is Tom Millichamp from a company called Edgewords. We deliver training around automated testing tools. And also Steve Brooker from EOH will be joining us shortly as well for this webinar. So these two webinars are concentrating more on automated testing. So we're looking at Microfocus's UFT, automated testing tool, but as part of a CI process. So the demo stack we are using is ALM Octane, Jenkins, Git and GitHub, which is what we looked at last week, and obviously Microfocus UFT. As I say, if you missed part one of the webinar, then there is a recording of that, and we will email out. Again, this is being recorded as well, so we'll email out the link to the recording to all the attendees later on today or tomorrow. Okay, so we saw this slide last week, but just revisiting this. So last week we were concentrating on looking at Microfocus's UFT, the automated testing tool, with source control. So we were looking at using UFT with Git, and also we were looking at GitHub as well, and some of the advantages of using GitHub. So last week was this section highlighted in the orange box is what we were concentrating on the last part of the last webinar. So in this webinar, we are going to be introducing ALM Octane and Jenkins continuous integration tool into the mix for our complete CI/CD process. Okay, so the first two topics we've covered in the last webinar. So we looked at the fact that we could start writing UFT automated tests. We could store those locally in a Git repository. And we could also create a GitHub repository, and we could push our new tests and our changes up to the GitHub repository. So we were using GitHub as our cloud-based repository for our entire UFT automated test suite. And we were seeing how we could have a number of people, number of staff, automated test engineers, all pulling changes, pushing their changes, pushing new tests up to that GitHub repository. So that's what we covered in and where we got to in the last week's webinar. So today, what we're going to cover is looking at Octane. So we're going to introduce the fact that in Octane, we can set up what's called a test runner that allows us to hook into our Git repository. In this case, ours is in GitHub, and discover UFT automated tests within the source control and create instances of those in Octane automatically for us. and then to be able to create test suites for those UFT tests and execute them directly from Octane. It actually executes them through Jenkins, but we don't even have to go into Jenkins. It will manage all of that automatically for us from Octane, as we'll see. The second part of today is just really looking at if you wanted to create your own Jenkins job or a Jenkins pipeline and do that manually to execute UFT test suite or a number of tests within a UFT test suite. We're going to have a look at how we can do that. So how we can create a job in Jenkins to execute UFT tests and to push the results back to ALM Octane. And we'll see that we can trigger that job either from Jenkins or we can do it directly from Octane by creating an Octane pipeline. And then finally, we're just going to have a look at a really nice feature for web or mobile if you're using Jenkins to execute your UFT tests, the fact that we can point and click set up parallel execution as well, so things like cross-browser testing. Okay, so quite a bit to get up and running with. Let's just come out of the slides a moment and I'll go into my virtual machine here where I have UFT installed. Okay, so if you remember last week we were looking at the fact that we were creating UFT automated tests and we were pushing those up to a GitHub repository. So in my browser, here's GitHub. Here is the repository. This is the same repository. I haven't changed it at all. I haven't touched it since last week's webinar. And here we've got our shared repository. Got a couple of tests. So there was one I created, one that Steve created. So this is our test suite. Only got 2 tests in the moment just to speed the demo up, but this would be our working UFT test suite stored in GitHub in the cloud. I also have Jenkins in the cloud again. So this is my Jenkins instance. And there are a couple of things that we need to have set up in Jenkins. So the first one, if I click on Manage Jenkins, the most important ones, if I go into Manage Plugins and the Jenkins plugins that are installed, and I scroll down in here, we've got all the Git plugins installed, which generally get installed by default when you set up Jenkins. But the one I wanted to highlight here is this one, the Microfocus Application Automation Tools. So this plugin is in fact really a suite of plugins developed by Microfocus that allow us to integrate the automated tools, ALM Octane, UFT, Performance Center, Load Runner, etc. So for us to be able to do what we're doing today with UFT, Octane, Jenkins, we need to install this plugin. So if this plugin isn't installed, then pretty straight at the top, you just click on Available Plugins, click in the filter, type in Microfocus, and it'll be listed here. It's not listed here at the moment because it's already installed, but it'll be listed here. We can then select it, and then we can download and install that, the options down at the bottom. So that's the first thing. The other thing I want to mention is this Jenkins server is running in the cloud on a Linux box somewhere. So when I execute jobs, I don't want my jobs, my UFT tests, to try and execute on the Jenkins machine. So I have also set up a node, and the node is going to be this local machine, or this virtual machine that I'm in at the moment, because this, if I minimize this, this is where UFT is installed. So I actually just need to, when we start running jobs and executing UFT tests, we have to say what the endpoint is. And the endpoint that we want to run them on is this machine, because this is the machine that's got UFT installed. So the only other thing I'm doing is just going into this node and I am connecting my machine. Okay. And there we go. So I've set up a connection now. So this is basically just a tunnel between my local machine that I'm delivering this training from and Jenkins. So I've just connected the two. So now when I run Jenkins jobs, I can actually execute them on my local machine that has UFT installed. Okay, so a couple of important things. Obviously, we need to tell Jenkins where we want to run the UFT tests, which is what I've just done there. And we need to ensure that we have the Microfocus application automation tool plugin installed for Jenkins. So what we're going to do now is set up in Octane something called a test runner. And a test runner is used to tell Octane about our Git repository and also our Jenkins server. So Octane then will set up a Jenkins job that every couple of minutes will poll the Git repository and look for UFT tests. And if it finds UFT tests, it will create instances of those in Octane automatically for me. So it's automatically discovering my UFT tests. I don't have to go and create them in Octane. It also allows me to execute those tests through Jenkins and also pass the results back to Octane from Jenkins, whether those tests passed or failed. So it's doing a lot of work, a lot of the integration automatically for me. So to do this, we actually need to go into the workspace settings. So we need to be a member of workspace admin, the rights for the Octane workspace. And then in here within the DevOps section, we can create our test runner. Okay, so let's actually have a look at that then. Let's go back into my machine. So we've talked about, we've got our GitHub repository with our UFT tests. Talked about the setup of Jenkins. I haven't created any jobs in here, literally. That's all I've done is installed the plugin, told it about my, or connected my local laptop as a node. So here's Octane. So we've got we've got a project here, or a workspace in Octane. Here's our storyboard, a team backlog, and it's got a couple of user stories in. If I click on the tests tab, then in here you can see there's a few Gherkin tests in here, but that's all. In fact, there's only those three. So there's no automated tests, no UFT tests in here at the moment. So to set up the test runner, I am actually workspace admin on this workspace. Top right, click on settings, go into the space station. Okay, now there is one thing that's already been done here, just to mention, and that is, so here are the settings. This is the workspace, EW shopping site. At the top, we've got all the settings here, customization we can do, entities, lists, etc. So on the DevOps tab, what I've interacted with here is first of all the CI server. So I've actually set up a connection between my Jenkins server that we just looked at and Octane. Very simple to do. Over on the right hand side, it tells you how to do that. Literally, you are just creating an access key in Octane, and then in the settings in Jenkins, in the ALM Octane settings, you can go and paste that in and set up the connection between the two. So that's already been done. So we've already connected to the CI server. So what I'm interested in now is the test runners. So if I click on test runners, add a test runner, and we'll give this a name. Here we can stipulate what kind of runner it is. So what framework we're using, what type of automated testing. So in this case, it's UFT. The CI server that we want to use for creating a job to discover tests and also for executing them. So this is my Jenkins server that we were just looking at. The source control type, so what kind of repository are the UFT tests stored in? Well, we saw that they're in GitHub, so it could be Git, GitHub, GitLab. So in here, it's Git, and then in here we put the repository. Now I can't remember the name of the repository, so I'm going to nip back to here, and I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard, or you could just copy the URL at the top and paste that in there. So that is my GitHub repository that has all my UFT tests in that we created last week. And then finally in here, I need to put in my GitHub credentials, so the credentials for that repository. We can then test the connection. Excellent. So we've now, with the test runner, we've actually just told Octane the Git repository that has my UFT tests in and the Jenkins server that we want to use for setting up these jobs dynamically. So if I just click save now. Okay, so now I've saved that, there's a couple of things that will have happened. First of all, if I go into Jenkins and I do a refresh, you can see there is a new job in here. So Octane has connected to the Jenkins server and set up a job, and as it says here, this is the UFT test discovery job. So this runs every couple of minutes, and it essentially polls the GitHub repository that we've pointed at, which is here, and it looks for any UFT tests. And if there are any UFT tests in here, it then creates instances of them in Octane. So if we go back to Octane now, and we come out of the settings, so top right, back into the Octane workspace, we can see, if I scroll down here at the bottom, let's just minimize that section there, we've got two automated tests, both UFT tests, not executed yet. So here's add to cart, here's my navigation. So just by setting up that test runner, Octane now will discover any UFT tests in my GitHub repository. So if anyone adds a test in there, then Octane will automatically discover that and create an instance of it within the backlog. It's probably at this point, so while you're developing tests and Octane's discovering them and adding them to the backlog, it's probably at this point that you may want to link these. So, these tests potentially will be covering things like user stories. So if I go into my automated test, my UFT test, and I click on relations, it's at this point I can always link this to, for example, a requirement or a user story. So let's choose user story in this case and click add. So quite hard to see, but if I scroll out, there we go. So we can see this automated test is now linked to this user story. So we've got some traceability. Okay, so what we've done there is we've created a test runner in Octane, which tells Octane about the Git repository in this case, GitHub repository in this case, where our UFT tests are stored. And also we tell it which Jenkins server we want to use. And as you can see, Octane's done the work for us. It's automatically set up a job to go and discover those UFT tests in the repository and create instances of them in Octane for us. And at that point, we may want to link our UFT tests to other entities within the backlog or within Octane. Okay, now we can create a test suite and put some of those automated tests into the test suite and execute those from Octane. So for those people who have used ALM Quality Center, the existing ALM.net as it's now called, then you'll remember that you can obviously save tests directly into ALM or Quality Center, and you can execute them straight from there. So this is quite nice. This is familiar because you're doing kind of like the same thing here. We can grab some tests, some UFT tests, we can put them in a test suite and we can execute them directly from Octane. But what's actually happening is behind the scenes, Octane is creating a Jenkins job automatically for you. So it's dynamically creating a Jenkins job that will go and pull those tests from GitHub in this case, and then execute them and then pass the results back to Octane. So it's doing all the work for you in the background. So let's have a look at that in action. So I'm going to create a test suite. I'm just in the team backlog at the moment, as you can see. Let's give this a name. We can specify the type of testing we're doing if we want. And that will do for now. So let's just click add. So all I'm doing is creating a test suite called regression. And if I go into the test suite and I click on the tests tab at the top, then here we can add some existing tests. So let's do add tests, and we can go and find our automated tests. We'll add both of those. Okay, so we've built a test suite called regression, and in here we've got our UFT tests that, remember, have been discovered automatically from our GitHub repository. Okay, and all I'm going to do is click Run Suite. Now there is something that we will have to amend here. So let's just execute this, and we'll execute this. Oh, that's fine as part of the first release, that's fine. And we'll just do a run. Now there is something that we do need to change here, but we only need to change it once. So we'll run this and we'll see that to begin with, this won't work. Right, if I go over to Jenkins and we do a refresh. Okay, so let's go back. We're back in Jenkins now, back in our Jenkins server. We already had this UFT test discovery job, but you can see there's a new job appeared. So what's happened is when we executed that test suite from Octane, it's automatically created a job for us on the Jenkins server to pull those particular UFT tests from the GitHub repository and execute them. Now you can see that this has failed, and the reason for that is this job has been created on the Jenkins server and is running on the Jenkins server. Now UFT is not installed on this Jenkins server, it's installed on my local laptop. So remember at the beginning I was talking about we set up a connection between my laptop. So I've got a node called Tom node, which is a connection between my laptop and Jenkins. So the only thing I do need to, or a bit of a gotcha here, is I do need to amend the job. So I just need to go into the job, and you only need to do this once. From then on, you can run the test suite whenever you want. Click on configure. So I'm just going into the settings of the job, and I want to tell this job to run on my laptop. So all I'm doing is telling it the node I want it to execute on. I don't want it to execute on the server itself. So if I turn here, we've got an option for Jenkins jobs, restrict where this project can be run. So I'm selecting that. And I'm telling it the node that I want this job to execute on. So this is the machine that actually has UFT installed. It's the endpoint. It's the actual machine that I want to run my tests on. I don't want them running on the Jenkins server. I want them running on my machine that's got UFT installed. And this could be a pool of nodes if you wanted. So let's just save that. And we'll go back. So that's the only change I have to make. So from then on, whenever I run my test suite, I've actually told it where I want the execution to take place. So let's just try that again. We'll just do run suite. So we can see tests are currently running. If I go into Jenkins, you can see down at the bottom, Tom node, so running on my machine. So in a moment or two, we should see the automated test start to execute. So this is actually, the job itself is pulling the GitHub repository, which has my UFT tests in, and then it's selecting the tests that were in the test suite, executing those on this node, and then finally it'll push the results back to Octane. So here's my UFT tests. These are the tests we created last week in the webinar from GitHub. So there's the first test executed. It should any second fire up another browser and execute the second test, which was the one that Steve created. In fact, the job, we can see that in there with the at the moment. Should be pushing the results back to Octane. Okay, so we can see that's finished. So this is the, as I say, I'm in Jenkins at the moment, and we can see the actual job. This job was created by Octane to execute that test suite. Here, the build's down at the bottom, so I can see that executed. And if I click on that, my resolution isn't brilliant, so I have to scroll down a bit. Then here we've got the test result, and we can also get to the UFT report. So I can click on that. We can see there's add to cart. Here's navigation. Both of those have passed. We can go in and we can see the details, and we can even get directly to the UFT results from in here. So we can see that was executed. And if I come back into Octane and we do a refresh, we should also see that the test results have been populated back in here. Okay, so here they are. Here are my two UFT tests, and we've got our pass. The require attention was for the first run. If I go into any of these tests, we can click on the runs, and then we can see the latest results in here. If at any point I want to run that test suite again, I can just go straight into the test suite and click run suite and execute it again. That's fine. I only have to set up, tell that job about the node once. So it's not going to recreate that test suite. The test suite will stay as it is within Jenkins. So the only thing I amended was where I wanted that job that was created by Octane in Jenkins, where I want it to actually execute. Each time though, it's pulling the latest tests from my GitHub repository. So obviously if we change the tests and we push those changes up to GitHub, then when I run the test suite, it's always running those latest changes because it's pulling the GitHub repository down, selecting the tests that we've specified in the test suite and executing them and pushing the results back to Octane. Okay, so that's the advantage of setting up a test runner. It gets Octane to do a lot of the work for us. It's automatically discovering our UFT tests in our Git repository. We can build test suites, get it to execute those test suites. So it automatically creates a Jenkins job to go and pull the GitHub repository, specify the UFT tests to run, execute them, and pass the results back to Octane. So we're doing all of that. All of that was actually achieved within Octane. The only thing I did change is where the actual job was going to execute, so where the UFT tests are going to execute, because obviously they have to execute on a machine that has UFT installed. So the second part of this is the fact that we can manually create pipelines or Jenkins jobs to execute our UFT tests as well from a Git repository. So we can set up a Jenkins job to go and pull a repository from Git, or GitHub in this case, and we can tell it where we want the tests to be executed and to execute them. And again, the execution we do using that Microfocus automated tools plugin for Jenkins. So it's using the same plugin to do this. All we're doing is setting up a Jenkins job to do this manually. And you might set up several Jenkins jobs. You might have a Jenkins job to execute your full regression suite, another one for your smoke tests. You know, it's completely up to you how many jobs you create. So a couple of things, obviously, Jenkins, ensuring that you've got the Git plugins installed, generally installed by default when you install Jenkins. Make sure you've installed the Microfocus Application Automation Tool plugin. And then we can create a Jenkins job. So this one, I'm just creating a very simple job. You know, your job, or you could have a pipeline that's far more complex than this. But this is just to get you going, really. Okay, so in this case, all I've done is create a new Jenkins job, and I've just designated it as a freestyle project. And then we can specify the details that we want to use. So let's actually have a look at that. I'll show you that actually in Jenkins is probably the easiest because I've already got one created for this. So let's go into Jenkins. Okay, so I've created a project here. Literally all I've done is hit new item, said it's a freestyle project, and given it a name. Then these are the sections that will appear that we need to complete. Okay, so we can obviously put a description in if we like, and we can tell users that this is a GitHub project. So this will just actually provide a link to the GitHub project. So if people want to look at the underlying project that is being pulled by Jenkins, they can do that. So GitHub project, here's the URL. So that's just the URL of here, my GitHub project that we created last week. Again, we probably want to restrict where this project can be run. So unless you've got a Jenkins server that also has UFT installed and the browsers that you want to run the tests, if they're, for example, web tests. If not, you will need to restrict where it can run, and you want to tell it which machines it can run on, which nodes which have UFT installed. Scroll down, we get to source code management. So all we've done here is select Git, and again, we've put in the URL for our GitHub repository that has our UFT tests. And it's this step that when we execute this job, we'll go and pull this repository down to the Jenkins workspace ready for execution. So this will go and fetch the GitHub repository from GitHub. Again, we can specify the branch. So this is just using the master branch, our main project. We could then set up build triggers. So we probably want to set up the job, test it first, but then we could set up build triggers. So we could actually get this job to execute. If we wanted our automated test to execute at 2 o'clock in the morning every day, then we could do that with the build periodically. Or we could set up a poll for source control changes. So if anyone changes anything in our GitHub repository, we can use that as a trigger to automatically kick those tests off. So any new commits into our GitHub repository, we could use as a build trigger. Okay, and then we get down to the actual build steps. So this is where the action takes place. This is what we want it to do. So in here, all we've done is click Add Build Step. And in here, we have just selected that we want to execute. You can see we've got all the execution here for Microfocus. This is all achieved by that plugin. Okay, and all we've done is chosen that we want to execute a Microfocus test from the file system. So remember, the step before is actually pulling our GitHub repository down. to the workspace, which has all of our UFT tests in, and then we are just using the Microfocus plugin to say, right, we want to execute those tests. What's quite nice is that we can actually specify the tests we want to execute. And tests can be specified by their name, by their ID, or even their folders. So if within our GitHub or our UFT project, if you like, we have our tests separated into folders and subfolders, then in here we can specify the folders that we want to execute. So in this case, I'm actually executing everything from the top level. So that's all I've done in there. I've added a build step just to say I want to execute Microfocus tests from the file system. In here for the tests, I've just said, right, I want to execute everything, please. We'll look at parallel mode in a moment. We'll just have a look at a simple job to begin with. And then we've also added a post build action. And the post build action is just this one, to publish the Microfocus test result. So this step is important because this will then push the results back to Octane, and it also provides us with a link that we can get down to our UFT results as we saw earlier, and we can also select from options here such as archiving all of those test results as well. So there are really only two steps to this. The first one is going to execute the tests. The second one is going to publish the results, and both of those are from the Microfocus plugin. It's a very simple job. Here's the job, and we could just hit build now and execute that directly from Jenkins. However, what's more useful is if we then, once we've created the job, if we go back to Octane, we can actually tell Octane about that job and get it to synchronize that job between Octane and Jenkins. So if I click on the masthead and we go to pipelines, so this is where we can synchronize all of our CI server jobs. So these might be developer jobs building the application. They might be testing jobs as we've got here to execute automated tests. So there's no pipelines in here at the moment, but if I click add in here, we can choose the CI server. We can choose the job. So here's the list of jobs. Here's the job that we were just looking at, our manually created job to execute our UFT tests. We can give that a name. If we want, we can specify a release that this is against. In here, we can also specify the type of job. Some options down at the bottom. So if we want, we could notify test owners if any of the tests fail. And that could be the notification, depending on how their notification settings are in Octane, could be by email or notifications up at the top in My Work. And click Save. So this now synchronizes, so I'm in Octane here, and this now synchronizes that job between Jenkins and Octane. And from here, I can view previous results, which test pass, which test failed, so the results of the build. I can jump to it straight in the CI server, so that'll just open it up in Jenkins, and I can even run. So I can now execute this Jenkins job, which executes my automated tests, either from Jenkins or directly from Octane. So if I click run, you can even have a live, choose pipeline. If we click choose pipeline at the top here, before you kick it off, we could choose the pipelines to monitor, and we could also see a live summary of that. So if we go back into Jenkins, we can see here's the job. We can see that executing. So any moment now, there we go. So that job has pulled those UFT tests, pulled the GitHub repository to local workspace, is now executing the tests using UFT. And then when it's finished, it will pass the results back to Octane. So again, in Octane, when we look at the tests, we can see the pass fails. We can see the run information for those. Now, just before I started this webinar, I did do an update of the Jenkins plugin. And the version of Octane I am currently using is a slightly older version, and I have actually managed to break the synchronization between these two. So ordinarily, and I'll show you on a slide what it looks like, we would be able to see the results of this in here. So once the job is finished in Octane, we'll be able to see whether the job passed or failed. We see the tests that are executed, whether they passed or failed. All of that information will be here in the pipelines. But I've unfortunately managed to break it just before I started the webinar. But I'll show you a slide of what that looks like. Okay, so again, we can see that the job is completed, it's finished. Here's my UFT report. I can see that's passed in there. Ordinarily, if I hit refresh in here, we would see the information in here, and on the right-hand side, we could look at the tests, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But if we go back to the tests themselves, then in here, these will automatically be updated. So we can see now we've got 2 passes in there because we've run that test twice. We just run it from the manual Jenkins job as well. So the results get updated in here. So as I say, it's a bit unfortunate because I just managed to break that beforehand, but it would look like this. So for the build, we can get the build information, whether it passed, whether it failed, how long it took, etc. For the tests, I can click on the test tab. This is all in that same pane I was in a few moments ago in the pipelines pane. So I can click on tests, I can see all the tests that were executed, I can see whether they passed, whether they failed, and there's also a link on the right I can actually select to get directly to the report. So if I get a test that fails, I can bring up the UFT testing report directly from Octane. So that's the interface we would normally get. As I say, I managed to break this by updating something and not something else just before. Okay, so that's just to show you that we could set up job manually in Jenkins to execute automated tests, so to go and pull them from a Git repository, to execute them, push the results back to Octane, and we might set up, as I say, a number of jobs depending on which tests we want to execute. Now the Jenkins plugin also has a very nice feature. So if I go back into that Jenkins job that we created, at the settings for in here, and if I scroll down to our build steps, so here's the build step that executes the tests, and you'll notice down here we can also use parallel mode. So if I select parallel for UFT tests, there we go. So I've enabled parallel running mode, and in here again we can specify the tests by their name or the folders of tests that we want to execute. And then in here, I'll show you what it looks like ordinarily. It seems to have remembered that information. So this is what it looks like. Specify the tests, and then we can set up the environments. So if we click on environment, web, and we can just use the environment wizard here. So environment wizard, let's run the first lot in Chrome, and then I'll add another environment, and we will use Firefox. Okay, so I'm enabling parallel mode, parallel execution for the web, cross-browser testing, and here 2 environments, Chrome and Firefox. So let's save that. And again, we could kick that off from here. If you kick it off from Jenkins, it would still synchronize. So it's still going to pass the results back to Octane. So it doesn't matter whether we build this manually or it's triggered on a schedule or triggered by source control changes, that's fine. The results still get populated back in Octane. Or we can obviously kick it off from Octane as well because we've got that synchronization. Although, as I say, I have an issue with mine at the moment. Yeah, it's not picking it up. Okay, so let's run that job again. We're now doing parallel execution. So we should actually see Chrome and Firefox open at the same time and execute our web tests in parallel. Okay, so there's Chrome. And there's Firefox. So we've actually got Chrome and Firefox now. And obviously they're tests. So we're going to end up with 4 sets of results because we've got 2 environments and 2 tests. So that was the first test that's executed. And then we've got our other UFT tested here, which should start in just a moment. There we go. Again, it's going to run in Chrome and Firefox. Okay, and then it's just you can see the jobs just results will be passed back to Octane. So it's quite a nice feature, as I say. If we're doing web testing, we can very simply set up parallel web execution, cross-browser testing. As I say, ordinarily, just because I managed to break something this morning, but ordinarily in Octane in the Pipelines tab, once we've executed that, on the right-hand side, we would see these tabs. So we can look at the tests, we can access the results from there, see what passed, what failed directly, and all within Octane. So once we've set up the Jenkins jobs, as I say, we can manage everything from Octane from there on. Obviously, the Jenkins jobs that you create, if you're doing it manually, can be much more sophisticated. You know, we can define what the build triggers are. We can even have closer, if we're using GitHub, like I am, closer GitHub integration. So we can do things like pass the results back to GitHub as well. And we might do things like, say, if anyone raises a pull request for a branch in GitHub, that will trigger the job. It'll execute the branch, pass the results back to GitHub, so then somebody can see whether the tests passed or failed, and if they passed, then they can say, right, that's fine, we can merge that into master. So you can set up quite complex integrations between Jenkins and GitHub for more control as well. But the architecture, the general architecture we've looked at is the first part of the webinar, we were looking at integrating UFT with source control, in this case Git and GitHub. In this second part, we've looked at the fact that we can introduce our CI server, so Jenkins in this case, and Octane. So Octane can be used to integrate with Jenkins, which can be used to discover UFT tests in our Git repository, to execute them, and also to pass the results back to Octane. And we've also looked at the fact that we can set up parallel execution for web and mobile, point and click within Jenkins as well. That's just one tool stack. Octane supports Jenkins, as we've just seen, but also Bamboo, TeamCity, TFS. Source control, essentially anything that begins with Git, so GitHub, Git, GitLab. It also covers Subversion, SVN, and it's very much the same with SVN as I've just shown you with Git and GitHub from the last webinar as well. Automated testing, we've been doing this with UFT, but you might be using LeanFT because we might be doing things like BDD, writing Gherkin scripts and automating those with LeanFT. So UFT, LeanFT. Also integrates with Mobile Center, Appium, Selenium. So most automated tools that produce XUnit type results, so NUnit, JUnit, TestNG type results, any of those we can execute and the results can be passed back to Octane. It can also discover those tests. So if you set up, if you've got, for example, a Selenium project and it's in Git, for example, and you set up a Jenkins job to execute that, so long as you use the publish results, and for example, if it's a JUnit type file, then Octane will create instances of all the tests that were executed, and then from there on, the results will be published back to Octane as well. So for automated testing, this is the great thing about Octane. It's not just the Microfocus tools. If you're also using open source tools, it supports those as well, and works in a very similar way. Okay, so just to mention again, my name's Tom Millichamp from a company called Edgewords, and we provide training courses. So we provide training on UFT. We've got a number of UFT courses if you're interested in using UFT for automation. The latest UFT that's just come out, 14.53, I think, has some great new features. So we've got things like mobile testing built into that. We've also got AI, artificial intelligence, for object recognition. So there's some great new features that are appearing in the latest versions of UFT. We also provide training on Octane, so we've got a 2-day classroom course using ALM Octane, and also Lean FT. So if you're doing things like BDD, Gherkin, and you're doing a code-driven automation, then we can provide training on Lean FT as well, and other courses such as Selenium. Steve, have you managed to join us? No. Okay, so my colleague Steve Brooker was hopefully going to attend, but it looks like he hasn't been able to. Okay, so the session's been recorded. So over the next day or two, I will email, or Steve Brooker will email all of the attendees with a recording of this. If you've got any questions in the meantime, then feel free to email Steve Brooker. So steve.brooker@eohuk.com. and we will try and help with those. Obviously, we'll send an email out, so any questions, you can just email off the back of that as well. A couple of URLs, obviously Octane help. So the online help is really good for Octane. If you want to set up any of those integrations, there's a good description on how to do that, and the system requirements. Okay, well, that's the end of the webinar. So as I say, we've had those 2 sessions. So hopefully now over last week and this week, you've seen how we can set up UFT, Octane, Jenkins, Git, GitHub to provide a full CI/CD architecture. Hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you very much for attending. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.